Hi, everyone. I'm going to be discussing sports nutrition with you all today. And we will get into, the fuel that we use for physical activity and exercise, as well as different micronutrients. So some of our minerals and vitamins that are important for performance as well as recovery. And finally, if time allows, we'll be talking about relative energy deficiency syndrome and different types of eating disorders that are associated with sport. Let's start by talking about fuel for physical activity. So the type of activity that we do, the intensity, duration, our exercise prescription really determines the amount of ATP that is needed or energy that is needed. It also determines what energy systems are predominantly used. Now, I'll start by saying that we are always using all of our pathways. However, if we are doing more fast, explosive movement, we might be relying on 80, maybe 90% from our phosphocreatine pathway. Where if we're doing still short duration, fast movement, but over like a 2-minute time period, maybe it's pushing more towards like glycolysis as our main pathway. And then more endurance type activities, we're probably relying, or we are relying on aerobic metabolism. So what you're seeing here is the breakdown of glucose into pyruvate entering the Krebs cycle, and then from there, the electron transport chain. So you're actually seeing glycolysis all the way through aerobic metabolism, okay? The glycolysis is going to be our anaerobic metabolism, although when we have oxygen present, it then goes and flows very nicely into our aerobic metabolism, as long as there's no buildup of the acetyl-CoA entering the Krebs cycle, right? At that point, we would actually turn that pyruvate into lactate. And, we can talk about how lactate can be used to fuel activity, and lactic acid is not always a bad thing. We can actually go through what's called the Cori cycle to use that lactate to then fuel activity. But in most cases, we'll have anaerobic metabolism. If oxygen is present, will flow into aerobic metabolism and create even more ATP. And when oxygen is not present, our final product will then be would be pyruvate and then into lactate. Our creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine pathway, what we're seeing here is just a one-step pathway, which is why it's used for fast explosive movement. We don't have all of these enzyme steps that are needed for our other pathways. Instead, it's just one step where phosphocreatine is broken into creatine plus a phosphate, and then that phosphate is used to produce ATP from ADP. Okay, so although this is a fast pathway, we also use up our phosphocreatine pretty quickly, which is why we can't rely on this pathway for long type of events. Now, what's nice is if we run a 100-meter dash and we're, predominantly using our phosphocreatine pathway, let's say, and then we rest for a period of time, we actually can replenish our phosphocreatine pretty quickly. So it depletes quickly, but we can replenish it quickly as well. Here you're seeing, our phosphocreatine and the ATP. So again, you have a good amount of phosphocreatine at rest. You're using that, but look how much is depleted within 14 seconds, okay? And so after that, we start to rely on glycolysis and those other pathways to fuel our activity. Unless we, again, take a little bit of a rest, replenish, and then try to do an explosive movement again, okay? With glycolysis, that's, as I mentioned, the next pathway that's going to turn on. And with glycolysis, we can either use glucose or glycogen to go through glycolysis. With glucose, we take it through many enzyme steps to produce ATP. And we produce 2 ATP with glucose going through glycolysis. Now, with glycogen, that also can be used to go through glycolysis. There's just an additional step that's taken. But in that, difference in the pathway at first with glycogen, we actually don't use as much ATP, we use one less. And so our net ATP produced when using glycogen through glycolysis is 3. With glycolysis, we're going to be fueling, if we don't have oxygen present again, we'll be fueling activity anaerobically for about 2 to 3 minutes. After that, other sources are going to become our predominant source for fuel. Okay, now we're going to be using glycolysis with glucose and glycogen as our 2 sources to then produce ATP during high intensity activity. Okay, so these are used, and carbohydrate is used to fuel high intensity activity. One thing to note is that glycogen storage is very limited. We don't have a ton of stores of carbohydrate in our body. And so we actually have to, if you're doing an endurance event, you might actually have to fuel during activity to stay at that high intensity level. And we'll talk about here during this lecture how training can actually help us to use fat as fuel for longer during activity, pushing this number here from that 65% of our VO2 max using a good amount of plasma-free fatty acids to maybe 70. So we can kind of push that a little bit to spare our glycogen stores. We'll also talk about how glycogen loading is an important piece to endurance events and planning for them. But even still, that glycogen storage is going to be limited. Okay, so here is the breakdown of ATP from glucose oxidation. Focus on the glycolysis, which is in this green box here. When we use glucose, we're producing 2 ATP. What I want to note is that when we have oxygen present and it's able to go through the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain, we produce much more ATP. Okay, which is why we can rely on the aerobic metabolism to fuel our longer duration endurance type activities. Going back to the idea that we don't store a lot of glucose, it's around 2,000, 2,500 calories of glucose are stored as glycogen. So endurance athletes, if you see it here, you know, this is why we see people hitting the wall during long endurance type activities, or why we see individuals out running for longer than an hour, taking things like gels or gummies with them to try to continue to supply that glucose to their body to fuel their high intensity activity. But let's focus on the fat for a second, and we'll get to lipids in a couple slides here. But to point out, look how much stored fat we have. And this individual, this data is coming from someone who is not obese. It's a normal, healthy weight individual that I believe, if I'm correct, has about 12% body fat, but still so much stores of fat. This is why fat is predominantly used to fuel activities of low intensity rest, things that we're able to just, pull from where we don't have to rely on that carbohydrate stores unless really needed. Like our brain, that really wants to pull carbohydrates. So we're letting at rest our brain pull that, and we're focusing and relying on fat to fuel other cells of our body because we have so much stored. Okay, back to carbohydrates. Like I mentioned, they're our primary fuel for vigorous exercise. when we think about our diet for athletes, especially endurance athletes, we want to focus on a good amount of carbohydrate. So the general recommendation is 55 to 70% of our total energy intake, really focusing on complex carbohydrates. That's our brown rice, whole wheat type products. Glucose is going to be a monosaccharide of our carbohydrates. It's broken down, or a type of our carbohydrates. It's broken down through metabolic pathways, as we saw before, to supply energy in the form of ATP for our cells to perform work. And we store carbohydrates as glycogen in our muscles and liver. And as we just saw, we have a limited supply of that. This video here, you can see someone actually hitting the wall. And, you know, this lecture, I'm glad I'm giving this week, the week of Boston Marathon, where it's very common for people to hit the wall at mile 20 plus, where they're building up a lot of lactate, especially in those last miles where there's greater elevation, there's greater, you know, incline changes that are occurring with the course pushing the body. And they're already running out of fuel, right? Right around that time too. So with thinking about the type of carbohydrates that we want to focus on in our diet, we said complex carbohydrates. So it's important to know that not all carbohydrates are created the same. We have high glycemic index carbohydrates, low glycemic index carbohydrates. And the glycemic index is a value that is assigned to foods based off that food being compared to the glycemic effect of pure glucose. And so it really helps predict a food's absorption rate. And what that means is how fast you're going to be able to use that carbohydrate, and how quickly it absorbs into your blood and you're able to even feel the impact, right? So when someone hits the wall, do we want to give them something that is absorbed more slowly? No, we want to give them something that's going to spike their blood glucose right away, which is like, you know, what some of these gels, even sugar tablets, things like that, that are really going to help. Other things that impact the food's absorption. So we talked about type of carbohydrate, how the food is prepared. That can actually change a food's natural glycemic index. Think about vegetables, fruits. If we grill them, if we saute them, that'll change their glycemic index. Even bananas, for instance, really green bananas will have a different glycemic index than brown bananas. And one way I like to describe this is in recipes where you want really, really sweet, like banana bread, you want your bananas to be brown because that's going to have a higher sugar concentration in it than the green bananas. The fat content of the food and the fiber content. So I know many people in the PT program are gearing up to run the Eugene half marathon or full marathon. So I thought I would share some little tips on glycemic index for runners. This whole glycemic index, I'll note, is ranked from 1 to 100. And again, it's all based off how fast the food is absorbed. The high glycemic index foods, they're going to be rapidly absorbed. So those are your sugars, your white bread, and your low glycemic index foods. They're going to be absorbed more slowly, but they provide more sustained source of energy. So there's a lot of strategy that goes into pre-competition meal, during competition meal, after competition meal. And we focus on both of these, right? So I'm not calling one good or bad here, but I will say that some are needed pre-run, some are needed post-run. Okay, so pre-run, a couple hours before, we would eat low glycemic index foods to provide more sustained energy release. And that helps to make sure that we're not running out of fuel and energy midway. Again, see that comment there, plenty of time for digestion. Now, during the run, this is like the gels, the gummies, those are going to be high glycemic index foods that are going to give that spike that's needed and is going to help the body to spare some of like the glycogen stores because you're giving your blood glucose, so you can spare some of the glycogen that has to be broken down to fuel the activity. Okay, now post-run, you want to eat both high and low glycemic index foods within 60 minutes. And that's going to maximize recovery. And really, the high glycemic index food is going to give you, the ability to spike your glucose, that energy that you need. And then having that with the low glycemic index foods, the low is going to help you to replenish and reload your glycogen, okay, for sustained energy. So focusing on both. Right, what does this look like? A yogurt with honey is like a pretty good option there. We have some, and maybe there's some granola made out of oats built into that. So you're really having some low glycemic index foods with some protein, which actually really helps with like glycogen replenishment and the protein coming from the yogurt. The yogurt also has carbohydrate in it, and it's a different form of carbohydrate. Which is really important for our different receptors in our body too. And then the honey would be a form of high glycemic index food. There's also a measure called glycemic load, and glycemic load combines both the quantity and the quality of carbohydrates. So again, we see different numbers indicating different levels of glycemic load. Our high is still going to be those things that we have really quick absorption, like the sweetened fruit juices you're seeing there, versus our low being, slower absorption, more sustained energy. And you can also see the moderate with glycemic load in there as well. So now you're just taking into like how much you're consuming plus the quality to give you a good sense of the amount or just the absorption rate of the glucose and carbohydrate in your body, how much you're getting, which all is important. Both are important factors. Okay, and then one of the things I mentioned with endurance activities, and again, thinking about your classmates who are about to run the Eugene Half Marathon, there is this concept of carbohydrate loading out there, and many people do not know how to do it correctly. Before I really dove into the research around sports nutrition, I thought it was eating spaghetti dinner the night before a race, but it's actually much more of a process, and there's a lot more strategy behind it than that. But if we do it right, glycogen loading can actually increase our muscle glycogen levels above what's normal. And that increase can be as much as 1.7 grams per 100 grams of muscle more than our normal amount, which is really, really important if you want to maintain a high intensity for a full half marathon or full marathon. Again, major benefit here, endurance capacity improves. You're able to, work at that high level for longer. And the drawback really is, one of the things that really many runners, endurance athletes complain about is, especially during taper week, is just feeling kind of like bloated or heavy, right? And so each gram of glycogen stores 2.7 grams of water with it, so it's a heavier fuel, but important. So what is the best way to actually go through carbohydrate loading? And the research points to this really takes about a week, okay? And if you can see, we start with 6 days before in that classical example. We are training hard and we're eating like a moderate amount of carbohydrate, okay? So the idea here being not even moderate, pretty low amount, right? So here for endurance athletes specifically, we're depleting our glycogen stores. Okay. And that's actually happening for like the first, like day 6, day 5, day 4 before the race. Then there's a turn. And at 3 days before the race, this classical model is saying that we are tapering our training. So we're doing less and we're eating a lot of carbohydrate. 70% of our total energy is coming from carbohydrate. So the thought here is if we deplete our glycogen stores, our cells are going to be so hungry for glucose and they're going to hold on to it more. And as a result, that's going to increase glycogen storage. Okay, so that's the classical model, really thinking about all of this a week prior to the race. And you'll notice training has tapered significantly, even with that large increase in carbohydrate. Okay. The researchers have also put out a contemporary model, and what you're seeing here is it's really just focusing on 2 days before the race, and we are also making it relative to the athlete, so it's 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight, and it's not focusing so much on the depletion. And what it's pointing to is it's really saying that it might be impractical or really unnecessary to have the fatiguing element. But that doesn't necessarily get to the idea of this glycogen depletion and increasing our stores by that 1.7 plus above what's normal. So again, there's just controversy in like what's the best way to do it. But with both the classical and contemporary model, you're not just focusing on the night before. And there's more models coming out, but I will say with that classical model, what we see is this there's this increased activity of glycogen synthase, which is an enzyme that then helps to increase our glycogen storage. And it's very similar to the idea of the idea being here, like we train low, we train not so much when we're talking about altitude here, but we train low in our glycogen stores and then we race high. We're ready to go and we just have even more to give. Now, that depletion phase, it's really important to take care of whole body because it can be related to weakness and immune system suppression. So just want to be careful with that too. Okay, and then recovery. So recovery from prolonged endurance exercise requires that our depleted fuel stores are replenished. And that helps, with damaged tissue being repaired. It helps with training adaptations. And really what's critical to these processes are whether we're taking in the right amount and type of nutrients. Muscle glycogen is an essential fuel for intense exercise, whether that's exercise is aerobic or anaerobic in nature, because we're using glucose or glycogen even in our anaerobic processes through glycolysis. So we need to make sure we're taking in enough carbohydrate after exercise to really make sure we're recovering and then adapting. And glycogen synthesis is a relatively slow process. And because of that, we really need to take special considerations on what we're eating, how we're eating it, when we're eating it. And if we don't, we're not going to fully recover, and we're not going to also maximize the rate of glycogen reloading. So in order to maximize the rate, we have to consume carbohydrate immediately post-exercise and then continue to consume carbohydrate at frequent intervals. Really what we see is that that first 30 minutes is really, really important. It's the most effective period. And then our glycogen reloading remains enhanced or moderately higher. So that means we can continue to, replenish our glycogen stores for 6 hours post-exercise. Okay. So if we can get something of some type of food source in our body that high with good amount of carbohydrate in that first 30 minutes, and then continue to supplement at frequent intervals and consume approximately 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour for that up to 6 hour period, that's going to be really important in maximizing glycogen synthesis. Now, if we take in a carbohydrate food source and there's protein in there as well, that's actually going to help with glycogen reloading. So by taking in a little bit of protein with our carbohydrate, we enhance glycogen replenishment. Now, there's mixed research on this as well, and all the research is pointing to, yes, protein is important. However, some research is saying like, yeah, if you have protein with it, it'll replenish it. And then other research is suggesting that it's only meaningful when our daily carbohydrate intake is low, or when we need a quick turnaround time for performance. So let's say you're competing on successive days, right? Or doing intense training, then you would need to have that protein to kind of really help replenish. Maybe not needed as much if you're only doing intense workouts Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Okay. And so what this is showing here is that with successive days of intense training, we gradually deplete our glycogen reserves, even when we have normal carbohydrate intake. So high carbohydrate diet is really needed in order to maintain the intensity that we want to work at. And, continue to replenish the glycogen stores to do so. If we were to be talking specifically in this lecture about fatigue, one of the main elements of fatigue is depletion of glycogen stores, right? And so this here saying that in order for us to continue to work at a high intensity multiple days in a row, we would need to increase our carbohydrate, the carbohydrate percentage of our diet. And this research specifically was looking at 80% of our caloric intake. In order to calculate your own carbohydrate needs, you can see kind of where you might fall in your activity level. So moderate duration, low intensity training, moderate to heavy endurance training, and then extreme exercise training. This is like going out and running, maybe a marathon plus, maybe not plus, but a marathon of what you actually need. And when I presented this to some athletes previously, they're like, there's no way someone's consuming 10 to 12 plus grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per day. But if we think about it and we do the math, let's say someone is 75 kilograms, or right, so we do 10 grams times 75 per day, like that might be 750 grams of carbohydrate. And if we actually look at how many calories that is, we do 750 times 4, that's 3,000 calories coming from carbohydrate. That's not unreasonable when we think about a marathon or we think about, long endurance training. When someone might be, especially, they're doing hours and hours of training, they might be consuming 4,000 calories a day. I think about the classic example that's out there, and I don't know if it's classic, but an example that's out there is they broke down Michael Phelps's diet in the past, and he was eating like 10,000 calories a day, right? So when we think about carbohydrate, 3,000, maybe 3,600 or more, then it's not as unreasonable. So you can calculate your own needs depending on what your training is for that day or your general training overall. Okay, moving to lipids. Lipids or fat, so they're gonna be stored in the muscle and adipose tissue as triglycerides, and triglycerides are made up of 3 fatty acids plus 1 glycerol molecule. And triglycerides give about 9, or fat gives about 9 calories per gram of energy. So we actually get more calories per gram as well. And when we are using triglycerides to fuel our activity, we are going to go through lipolysis, which we're going to break down in this process, triglycerides into glycerol and then 3 fatty acids. And then from there, the fatty acids are transported through the blood to the working cells that are in need of that energy, and they go through beta oxidation. Beta oxidation, what's happening here is we're actually cleaving 2 carbon units at a time from the fatty acid chain. We're then taking those 2 carbon units and turning them into acetyl-CoA, which then can enter the Krebs cycle to create and generate ATP to fuel our activity. Fat's mainly going to be used for lower intensity activities. And one reason for this is that it's just there's just more steps that take place in the process as one reason. Now, fatty acid chains are typically found in the human body around 16 to 18 carbons long. And so when we break these into these 2 carbon units, the 16 carbon long chain or fatty acid chain is going to make 8 turns of the Krebs cycle, right? So we're getting a lot of energy from these fatty acids. Okay, here is just another visual of it. So we break down the triglyceride into glycerol and our 3 fatty acids, and then the fatty acid chains are activated by coenzyme A. And then they go through beta oxidation, cleaving 2 carbons at a time to create acetyl-CoA. And then from there, they're able to go through the Krebs cycle. Again, if we have a 16 carbon chain, divide that by 2 because we're taking 2 off at a time and we're having 8 turns of that Krebs cycle. Okay, and this is just an example showing you where we're cleaving the 2 carbon segments, right? And so the 16, which is actually, this is the most common fatty acid chain found in the human body. We're taking the 2 carbon off, and then we're making a 14 carbon chain, making a 12 carbon chain, and continuing through to then create all that ATP. And then lastly, on beta oxidation, what I want you to see here is the difference between the 16 carbon fatty acid chain and the glucose, where the glucose is creating 2 pyruvate molecules. And then from there, those 2 pyruvate molecules are going through the Krebs cycle, making 2 turns, whereas the 16 carbon chain is going to produce 8 acetyl-CoA to go through the Krebs cycle, 8 turns. So much more energy is produced from beta oxidation than the breakdown of glucose through glycolysis. Okay, so based off of that, we get a lot of ATP that can help us fuel our exercise. Again, this is predominantly used to fuel low intensity exercise. It's an abundant energy source. We have lots of it. Plus, we have just breaking down one fatty acid chain has, all the turns of the Krebs cycle to produce lots of ATP. And so we just get a lot more bang for our buck here. We can actually, this image here, it shows your respiratory exchange ratio, which we brought up when we were talking about exercise testing as a measure of maximal intensity. And that's because we can see what type of fuel you're using. And we know at high intensity exercise where your RER is getting to 1 or above, you are using carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are used to fuel high intensity exercise. But when we start you out on that exercise test, we might have you walking at a really slow pace and your RER is closer to 0.7, right? And that means you're closer to using 100% fats to fuel your activity. So we can use your respiratory exchange ratio to guide, what type of fuel is being predominantly used to fuel exercise. So if someone truly wanted to find their fat burning zone, they could actually use their respiratory exchange ratio, and that would be the most accurate way to do so in understanding what is that like best or sweet spot in your burning most calories and most calories from fat during your activity. Okay, I alluded to the idea that we can actually increase our fat oxidation and use of fat to fuel our activity, and we can do so through our training. So just through endurance exercise training, we can increase the ability to oxidize fatty acids, which just means using fat to fuel the activity. This is important because it can spare carbohydrate for prolonged intense training or competition, right? So let me give you this example and then we'll think about a race, okay? So in a group of trained individuals, from research, it was found that exercise at 62 to 63% of VO2 max was the optimal intensity for fat oxidation. So this is trained individuals. Whereas individuals that were less trained, that optimal intensity for fat oxidation was around 50% of their VO2 max. So just right there, we're showing that training is bumping up the intensity at VO2 max that we can work at for optimal fat oxidation, going from 50 and less trained to 62, 63%. Why is this important? So think about like if I'm out running a marathon, I'm not running at 100% of my VO2 max, right? I might be running at 70%. If I'm at 70% of my VO2 max, I'm using potentially more fat to fuel that intensity than I am carbohydrate. And I'm definitely using more fat to fuel that activity than if I were not trained at all. Right? Because that optimal zone is about 12% downward, right? And so if we can bump up what that optimal intensity for fat oxidation is, that means, any intensity a little bit higher than that too, we're using more fat to fuel it. Okay? Doesn't mean we're not using carbohydrates, but we're using less than if our optimal fat zone was at 50%. Okay? Other things to consider is that obesity, type 2 diabetes, age, they all have an influence on how or our capacity to oxidize fat for fuel. And specifically, older age, obesity, type 2, they're going to have impaired capacity to oxidize fat for fuel. So that leads to higher storage of fatty acids because we're not burning them at the same rate and using them, I should say, at the same rate and capacity as individuals that are not obese, don't have diabetes, and younger age groups. So if training can help us to improve our capacity to oxidize fats, what type of training? So things like exercise intensity and duration are really important here. Fat oxidation rates increase from low to moderate intensities and then decrease when the intensity becomes high. Maximal rates of fat oxidation have been shown to be reached at intensities between 59 to 64%, which aligns with the previous study in trained individuals, and 47 to 52% of VO2 max in normal, healthy, untrained. So again, aligning with that 50% on the other slide. And another thing to consider is what we're actually eating prior to activity. So if we consume carbohydrates hours before exercise, that's going to reduce the rate of fat oxidation compared to fasted conditions. Not that you shouldn't consume something, but thinking about consuming some type of fuel source like or food that has potentially some fat in it too could be helpful here. That's not going to be, especially it's hours before where we're not worried about cramping. Okay, and then looking at our fat use throughout the day at rest and in fasted conditions, that is the primary fuel source, as I mentioned before. 60 to 66% of fuel being used by the body is from fat. We're only around 33% is from carbohydrate to give us energy specifically. And at low intensity exercise, as we've said now a couple times, that is the primary fuel source used. So looking at, the makeup of our diet, we think about fat being around 20 to 35% of our calories per day. We should be focusing on monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats and really minimizing saturated fats and completely eliminating trans fatty acids. And that just is important for overall health. It lowers the risk of heart disease. Saturated fat, thinking about less than 7% of our total calories or energy intake each day should be coming from saturated fat. And, a lot of times saturated fat is hidden in things like baked goods and stuff, but that's the general rule. Now, all of that to say, there are many, many benefits of fat intake that we need to consider. So focusing on monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, really important. We don't want to eliminate fat at all. Like fat has a very important role in our body. It can help prevent joint injuries, soft tissue injuries, systemic and even airway inflammation. It can decrease the risk of endocrine system abnormalities, so things that have to do with our hormones. We see a lot of people that cut fat or are on a really low fat diet that are also athletes, unfortunately have issues with hormonal imbalances that can lead to other injuries and issues for athletes. And then omega-3 fatty acids have been shown to reduce cardiac events, cardiac arrhythmias, mortality, and they're important in muscular recovery and reducing inflammation too. I actually recently went to a chiropractor and he asked me about taking an omega-3 fatty acid supplement if I was doing so. And that is something that he very much believed was going to be important for my recovery and reducing inflammation. So it's something clinicians are recommending as well. Okay, and so thinking about that fat burning zone, it's different for each individual. As we saw, it's different by age, it's different by sex, it's different by training status too. So I put this up here because I think a lot of gyms, I don't know if they do so anymore, but a lot of gyms would actually post signs, this is the best fat burning zone, and it's very relative to the person, and it's important to consider your training status and also know that you can increase your capacity for fat oxidation through training. So the last thing I'll say around fat is, thinking about our timing of fat. So prior to exercise, you have to kind of like learn your body and what works. Some people experience a lot of cramps from the food they eat. So unfortunately, fat, because it is something that can be harder to break down, can cause more cramps, but not enough can cause early fatigue onset, because if we don't have enough fat, that means we are starting to cut into our glycogen stores earlier. Trying to limit high-fat foods before and during exercise to limit things like cramps and other issues it might cause. But also during exercise, you're really focusing on trying to give that boost. If you do need fuel, it's to give that boost to continue to go. So it's really the carbohydrate and the simple carbohydrates that are important there. And then the daily caloric intake, around 30% of your total calories, and really focusing on monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. Okay, protein. So protein comprised of amino acids. It contains a carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And the R group of the amino acid is specific to each amino acid. So that's the side chain there is what makes the amino acid different, and it makes up, that's why we have so many different amino acids. Proteins are going to give minimal energy contribution. They're primarily used for structural or enzymatic purposes in the body. So when we think about them being used to produce energy, it's really low, like less than 3% at rest. And even during extreme exercise, we might be relying on protein to help fuel around 10%. And the only caveat to that would be if we're in a mode of starvation, or we are, on a very, very, very high protein diet that we use more. Okay, even when we're using protein for energy, it has to go through gluconeogenesis or lipogenesis to then actually go through the pathways, our metabolic pathways, to then produce ATP. We do get about 4 calories per gram of protein for energy. Okay, as I mentioned, it's rarely used as a substrate, except when like in starvation mode or very high protein diets where we're also on low carbohydrate, low fat diets. But if we are using it for energy, it will be converted to glucose or acetyl-CoA through gluconeogenesis. And from there, we then can go through the Krebs cycle. So I'll show you a schematic of this in the next slide. Now, when we think about using protein to fuel our energy, the energy yield is a little bit more difficult to determine because we have to remove nitrogen, and that actually in itself requires ATP. And so while that seems to be minimal, we don't want to just ignore that completely. So with the amino acids, this is the schematic of how amino acids are then used to produce ATP. So we have our amino acid, goes through a process of deamination, and then that process we remove nitrogen. It then has our carbon skeleton. We're able to go through glycolysis into creating pyruvate or directly creating acetyl-CoA. So with either one, we go straight to acetyl-CoA, or we are turning it into pyruvate, and then that pyruvate's being turned into acetyl-CoA to then enter the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain for energy production. Proteins, like I said, they're mainly used for structural or enzymatic purposes. So some of our key responsibilities of protein are for cell growth, repair and maintenance, production of enzymes and hormones, fluid and electrolyte balance, acid-base balance. They're important in our immune functioning. They do act as a small energy source for the body. They're important in nutrient transport and storage, and also have a role in blood clotting, as well as many others. There are 9 essential amino acids, and then with these 9 essential amino acids, they cannot be produced in sufficient quantities to meet our physiological needs. So the body cannot produce them. They need to be obtained from the food that we eat. And then there are 11 non-essential amino acids, and these can be synthesized in sufficient quantities by the body. So in order for us to accomplish protein synthesis, all essential amino acids must be available to the cell. So our body can make the non-essential amino acids. So we have those already, okay? But the 9 essential amino acids all must be available to the cell in order for us to go through protein synthesis. We have what's called in our diet typically a limiting amino acid. This is the essential amino acid that is missing or we have in the smallest supply in our body. And it's the limiting amino acid that then slows down or halts protein synthesis. So protein synthesis can only occur when we have all essential amino acids. So if we don't have one, it's going to halt. Okay, so the limiting amino acid is limiting because it's limiting protein synthesis. So we really want to focus on getting complete proteins in our diet, okay? So we'll start with the definition of incomplete protein. This is going to be a low quality diet where there's insufficient essential amino acids. It's not going to support protein synthesis, so it's not going to support growth, health, recovery. Complete protein, that's going to be high quality, and we have all the amino acids that we need for protein synthesis. And so it is going to support growth and health. And typically, our complete proteins we can get from consuming soy protein, animal products. It's when we are, some people are vegetarians. And so we have to be really strategic about the meals that we are creating for ourselves to make sure we're getting all 9 essential amino acids. And so that might look like mutual supplementation, combining 2 or more incomplete protein sources to make a complete protein. It may look like using complementary proteins, 2 or more foods that we're combining to supply all the 9 essential amino acids for a complete protein. And so here are some examples where we're combining different foods to then make a complete protein combination. Okay. So peanut butter and bread, barley and lentil soup, corn tortilla and beans. Those are going to be, when combined, help to produce a complete protein. Okay, and other examples there too. Okay, we can also look at if we are getting enough protein, too much protein, too little protein by our nitrogen balance. This is not something that is done often, but sometimes in blood tests, physicians will test for this. So with a nitrogen balance, this is when nitrogen consumption and nitrogen excretion are equal, and it's found in healthy adults, not pregnant, right? This is what we would want in non-pregnant individuals. A positive nitrogen balance, this is going to be needed during periods of growth, pregnancy, recovery from illness, or protein deficiency. That's when we find a positive nitrogen balance. And then a negative nitrogen balance, we have our nitrogen consumption is greater than our nitrogen excretion, and this can be a result of starvation, consumption of very low energy diets, severe illness, infections, injuries. So again, this might be something that a physician orders to understand health status. When considering how much protein is needed each day, this depends on someone's body size or their body weight along with their activity level. So for sedentary healthy individuals, 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day is the recommendation. It's also recommended that the percentage of energy is 10 to 35% of our total energy intake. And as I mentioned, higher during exercise, growth, and development. So while a sedentary individual needs 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, active individuals, like recreationally active, might need 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram. Endurance athletes need 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram, ultra endurance 1.2 to 2.0 2 grams per kilogram, and strength athletes 1.6 to 1.7 grams per kilogram. So our protein needs as athletes are going to be higher than individuals that are sedentary. And you can take a look at this, and some people will fluctuate through how much protein they're consuming daily. And then some athletes will, if you're a strength athlete and one day you're getting 1.6, but you needed 1.7, you might make up for that the next day, right? So there is some flexibility in that, although what you're consuming and when you're consuming is an important part of performance. And, there's always those sweet spots right after exercise that you should be getting quite a bit. Now, this chart I like because it breaks it down, or table I like because it breaks it down a little bit more. And so here you're seeing that sedentary athletes still 0.8, but then you have non-vegetarian and vegetarian, and you can see that things are bumped up a little bit with the vegetarian endurance athletes and vegetarian strength athletes, and that just is based off of absorption of certain foods and the complete versus non-complete amino acids that we're getting in a vegetarian diet versus a non-vegetarian that can be getting all essential amino acids from an animal protein or animal protein. Now, as I mentioned, it's really important to think about your protein needs immediately after exercise. And so when someone is doing a split routine, meaning you're not doing, maybe you're just doing lower body, or maybe you're doing upper body, and you're not using all major muscle groups of the body, you can actually take in less protein than someone that's doing a whole body routine, who would need more protein because they're working more muscle groups. So general rule is somewhere between 20 to 25 grams within 1 hour post-exercise. That number, I will say in research, fluctuates a little bit in that, it could be 20 to 30, it could be 15 to 25 that we're seeing in research, but what's consistent is that 1 hour post-exercise. And that's for a split routine. The whole body routine, there's more variability in research here with the amount. Some will say 25, some will say 40, okay? But again, the idea being 1 hour post-exercise, getting high quality protein is really important. And high quality protein, what does that mean? Making sure the protein includes all essential amino acids if you want to kickstart protein synthesis, okay? And now I talked about the mTOR pathway in a previous lecture and the importance for turning on that pathway for protein synthesis, hypertrophy. And one of the factors that helps to turn on that is leucine amino acids. So making sure that your protein source that you're consuming after exercise includes all essential amino acids, including 2 to 3 grams of leucine. And just like carbohydrate reloading is enhanced when we have protein intake with it, carbohydrate intake with protein increases protein absorption too post-exercise. So thinking about a food source, potentially like a protein bar, that actually helps to increase protein absorption and kickstart protein synthesis. Fluid intake. Your fluid needs, we want to really focus on making sure we stay hydrated during exercise, after exercise. It's a really important piece to homeostasis. And so you can calculate your fluid needs by your body weight times 0.67. And the recommendations: pre-exercise, taking in about 6 to 8 ounces of water or sport drink about 15 minutes before practice. Avoid carbonated beverages, caffeine, no fruit juices. During exercise, 4 to 8 ounces every 15 minutes, if possible. And you can alternate between sport drink and water if it's a longer duration activity that the electrolytes would be valuable. from the sport drink. Post-exercise, 24 ounces for every pound lost within 2 hours of exercise. This can be really challenging. Like I think about my own activity, and during exercise, there's no way I'm consuming 4 to 8 ounces every 15 minutes. Like I go out for a 2-hour run and don't drink anything, right? So that's not ideal either, but this is going to be for optimal performance is what the research is saying. And really focusing on this post-exercise piece to make sure you're rehydrating after the event is really critical. This is why a lot of coaches will weigh their athletes after like a summer preseason to make sure that they're getting the fluid that they need to stay hydrated. When you are going to be consuming sports drinks, looking for a sports drink that has these components, so 460 to 690 milligrams of sodium, 68 to 195 milligrams of potassium, and then 5 to 10% carbohydrate. That carbohydrate is going to be really important because it helps to keep sodium, and then water follows sodium. So we're keeping water in the body and we're not just filtering everything out. The simplest way to put it. Okay. All right. So here are our recommendations again when it comes to hydration before, pre-exercise, during, and post. Now the before I didn't mention, but this would be consuming a little bit more 2 hours before practice or event, rather than immediately before. And then still used and highly, I mean, it works, is the pee scale or urine color, right? You can actually test your hydration level based off of your urine color, with the darker color meaning you better drink up because you want it to be in the lighter color. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and stop there for this lecture, and I'll start back up talking about event day nutrition and what that looks like for optimal performance. And then we'll get into some minerals and vitamins and the importance of those, followed by talking about disordered eating with sport and the complications that come with that. So we'll talk soon. Thanks.